प्रतिष्ठा की बात है इस शहर के लिए, इस जगह के लिए, कि दुनिया के विद्वान इस पे रुचि ले रहे हैं और उसमें तरह तरह के नए आइडियाज को लेकर के उसको स्टडी करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. तो थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर accepting the invitation and coming down to Lakhisarai and even working for the Lakhisarai.
Thank you. Is this a microphone?
It will be recorded.
Okay. It's such a great pleasure and an honour to be here to celebrate the opening of this fantastic museum and to raise awareness of the incredibly rich heritage, architectural, sculptural, religious, historical heritage of the region. I'm coming to talk about just the architectural remains at Ashokdam that Mr. Manoranjanji was very kind to show me January of this year. To introduce myself a little bit, I'm Fiona Buckee, as you know. And I'm a researcher and lecturer specializing in the design of Indian temples. Next slide, please. So my PhD, just to give you some backdrop, was looking at Temple 45 at Sanchi, another great Buddhist site, and analyzing the architectural remains there to try and work out what the spire looked like. And as part of that PhD, I was also looking at the evolution and development of Latina temples. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can you go back? Sorry. Of Latina temples, which are in some ways the archetypal or one of the most well-known North Indian temple types, with this curved spire named after the Lata, which means creeper, of Gavaksha that climb down the central spine of the spires. So this is sort of where I'm coming from. And as a result, a lot of my field work was spent traveling around central India and Madhya Pradesh and thinking about questions, for example, next slide please, how these temple types, the earliest of which are from the 7th century, arose from the only Gupta period temple that we found with vestiges of a spire remaining. And this is from 500 to 525. So what's happening in between the Gupta period that leads to these mature, fully developed Latina temples? So this question of the origins and early development of Latina temples was on my mind. Next slide, please. Subsequent to publishing a paper on the architectural history of Mandeshri Hill in Kaimur district, I've recently been concentrating in particular on the inadequately studied architectural heritage of Bihar, because the wealth of temple remains, many of them unknown, that are from these sort of Gupta heartlands, suggest that this was one of the crucibles from which this mainstream Nagra, these Latina temples and the related temples, originated and developed. And this isn't an unequivocal point. Two of the heavyweights of Indian temple architecture, Adam Hardy and Michael Meister, disagree on this. So it's a live question, it's not a resolved question. I visited, next slide please. I visited Rajahana, or Lakhisarai, Ashokdam in January, as I said, and I was very excited, given my background and interest in Latinas and Central Indian architecture, on what I saw there. And that is why I'm excited, is what I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by talking about the lineages of North Indian temple architecture. This may seem a little bit long, and Professor Kumar, it is relevant. This is relevant to Krimila because it shows how exciting and unusual and unique these remains are, because they should be seen in the context of what's happening further west. And also, you've been talking about how Krimila the profile needs to be raised because of its significance for, Buddhist history and sculptural history. But what's exciting here is it makes them directly relevant for broad questions of North Indian temple architecture. So it brings them onto the stage for exciting active, unresolved architectural questions that scholars all over the world are grappling with. So this is why we're going to spend a bit of time looking at the lineages, and then we're going to talk about the actual remains that I saw at Ashokdam. By the way, I'm sorry I'm not speaking in Hindi. And in a way, I feel like I'm coming at it a little bit blind, because all these wonderful lectures that I've been hearing, I'm sure I've been missing some key points, but I'll probably be contradicted by what I'm saying. But in this coming at it blind, it's an exercise in what architecture can tell you, because I'm reading the architecture, and it's in these clues when we're talking about iconography. Is it this? Is it that? Is the flick of the eye like this or whatever? Architecture can contain some of the answers, because where do the sculptures come from? They come from temples. So I'll talk about what I saw, and we'll try and work out questions of date, how many temples, what they look like, that kind of thing. And then at the end, depending on how much time we have, we'll have a sort of discussion and concluding thoughts. So, next question, please. Next slide, please. So the knowledge and skills required to design and build early Indian temples were passed on within architectural and sculptural guilds, largely through a system of apprenticeship. Whilst recent studies of the Vastu Shastras suggest that they contain a greater degree of accurate architectural information than was once thought, the sparseness of the information that they contain, ambiguities regarding what specific architectural terms refer to, as well as some clear inaccuracies, show that they clearly couldn't be used as practical manuals teaching exactly how to build a temple, how to draw a detailed elevation, how to measure out and carve the architectural elements, etc. Instead, the fundamentals of structural temple design were passed on from practicing sculptor or architect to pupil, likely with accompanying drawings showing key geometries and proportional measurements. Whilst one should not overlook the skill, vision, and artistry of the individuals who were responsible for building these magnificent monuments, the chain of apprenticeship combined with a design conservatism means that the way the designs of temples morph and change in a slow, almost organic seeming way lends the development of Indian temple architecture to analogies with evolutionary biology, and I sometimes think, perhaps even better, evolutionary linguistics. Furthermore, because particular architectural features or types, Gata Pallava pillars, for example, the pillars with vases of plenty at the top of the base, the shape of eaves, in some senses the boring bits, they can contain the clues in terms of proportion and size that can accurately date temples or sculptures that are attached to them in ways that the sculptural parts can't. It's sort of more objectively quantifiable in some cases. This organic picture, of course, only goes so far, and it's overlaid with, shaped and propelled by more practical factors: topography, river and trade routes, which Professor Kumar's worked on, access to stone, where the quarries are, dynastic fortunes, marriage alliances, individual predilections, etc., etc. So all of these things play in. This is a bit distracting. But because of the conservatism that comes about through this chain of apprenticeship, it's a slow evolution of form, which again allows you to date things quite clearly. The same types slowly evolving, slowly changing, which is why they're so useful. Next slide, please. So stone structural Indian temples begin to be built in North India in the 5th century CE during the Gupta period, alongside heftier brick monuments adorned with terracotta and stucco ornament. This is a gestational period of stone temple architecture, as it were. And in the end of the 6th century and the latter quarter of the 7th century, we see the formation and maturation of different lineages, next slide please, of temple architecture. So these different families, these different strands or languages emerge. Next slide please. These lineages all share some of the same DNA, as it were, in that their designs reach back to ancient timber architectural types, and they're comprised of, particularly their spires, combinations of different edicures. That is, stylized images of small buildings that are combined to create multi-edicular upper stories. However, the way they're depicted and the logic with which they're combined splits off from the different lineages of temple architecture, diverging and using the modules in different ways. And the different families of temple architecture put them together in different ways according to different organizational logic, leading to their designs evolving along different developmental pathways. Which means, if we look here at, next slide please. If we look here at, say, the Bodhi temple at Bodh Gaya, and we look at, say, the Svarga Brahma temple in Alampur, which, although it's in Dravidian territories, is a North Indian temple type, they're using the same things, i.e., if we go back one slide, please. They're using the same things, which is at the bottom right, little Amalaka shrines, little Amalaka topped shrines on the corners to form the Kana Kuta, and they're using Valabis, that is barrel-roofed shrines with horseshoe arch gables, cascading down the front spire. So both of them are doing that. They're both using these little simple shrine types in their spires, but they're doing it a different way. They're organizing it in a different way. Next slide, please. Which means, although Arisan temples, say, share similar qualities with temples from central India, they're different. It's a different family, it's a different lineage, it's a different guild of craftsmen building it. Okay, next slide, please. Actually, sorry, can we go back one? Sorry. And one more. So if we take a sweep of what's going on in the late 6th to 7th century, at Bodh Gaya we see a sole surviving example of a Magadha period temple, the Bodhi temple, plastered over, added to, and much changed. And we could call this the Magadha school of temple architecture. Next slide, please. The temples are built of brick and stucco, and they also occur at Nalanda. Further south, if we're thinking of different examples, at Chhattisgarh in the 7th century, we see brick and stone Dakshina Kushala temples. For example, the Rajiva Lochana temple at Rajim. But in terms of temple lineages, next slide please, by far the most successful, in terms of spread and prolificacy, is the mainstream Nagra family. This name was coined by Adam Hardy, so called because of how such a large swathe of India was covered by these particular temple types, whereas regional temple lineages are much more small and localized. Next slide, please. So, sorry, go back. So, I've got the pointer. So, during the 7th century, the most popular, from the 7th to the 10th century, the most popular mainstream Nangra temple type is this Latina. And you see them being built in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, central India, Rajasthan, Gujarat. Down here we get some later mainstream temples. We get early Latina, North Indian temples in both Karnataka and Telangana. So it spreads. This is a lineage that's building and building and building. And how it moves is another interesting question. Next slide, please. What's interesting is you get 7th century mainstream Nagra temple architecture appearing quite far east at Magadha sites. For example, 7th century Bodh Gaya, we see on the left hand pillars, Ghatapallava pillars, which are clearly from within the mainstream Nagra temple building tradition. And if you see this arrangement of the Gavaksha up at the top with a Simha face in the middle, these are mainstream Nagra parts, which means that there was a guild of mainstream Nagra architects working at Bodh Gaya at the same time as a guild of architects that were working in the Magadha style and built the Mahabodhi temple. And this is interesting. They're not communicating, you're not feeling yet any mutual influence. They're just working there side by side at the same time. Next slide, please. And the same is true at Nalanda, which is not far from Bodh Gaya. On the one hand, we have a Magadha guild of architects building brick and stucco temples. The Site 12, for example, is a base of a temple which is very similar in design actually to Bodh Gaya in some ways. But at the same time, we have Temple 2, which is a pure mainstream Nagra, meaning that they're making beautiful, mainstream proportioned, elegant temples alongside the Magadha architects. And it's interesting because Temple 2 is placed at rather a strange angle according to the other monastic settlements. So that's a whole other question. But 7th century, we're seeing these two guilds working side by side. Next slide, please. So why am I telling you all this? Why is this interesting and relevant to Lakhisarai and what we're talking about at this seminar? Because all of this contextualizes why the remains at Ashokdam are so significant for the study of the origins and early development of Indian temple architecture, and what a unique set they are. Because what we are seeing at Ashokdam, to put the cart before the horse and spoil the conclusion, I believe, as we'll discuss next, is our only substantively surviving example of mainstream Nagra temples reaching this far east, and what's more, uniquely carved out of this dark stone. And I probably haven't read enough about this, but according to Asher, the quarries are fairly local. He said it was a phyllite, but I've been hearing that it might be other stones. But either way, this dark stone that's going to go on to become synonymous with Pala sculpture or Pala period sculpture across this part of East Bihar and down into West Bengal. What we are seeing here, as I will argue in the conclusion, is our only example of a cluster of what I will call Eastern Nagra temples, sharing key aspects of mainstream Nagra temple design, along with temples further west, but translated into the dark stone, carved by local craftsmen, and therefore with their own characteristics. These, I will argue, are the forerunners of the Nagra elements that will then be translated into dark stone features that will be used in the brick temples, in aspects of the dark stone bits of architecture and sculpture that will then be used in the brick Pala temples, of which we have no much surviving remains. They also feed direct, and this is why they're important. This is why the site is important. This is why Lakhisarai is important. This is why it's going to start becoming part of the scholarly. I mean, it already is part of the scholarly conversation, but we're going to have some architecture thrown in as well. It feeds directly into ongoing debates regarding questions of the origins and early years of Nagra structural temple architecture. This handful of remains from a set of small temples have a disproportionate bearing on North Indian temple architecture in general, which is another reason why the legacy of Krimila should be more widely recognized. So let's go on to look at them now. Next slide, please. So I'd like to say that this is preliminary. I'm coming at this relatively recently, and so what you're getting is an assessment of just what I'm seeing from an architectural point of view. And I've done some reading, but things like I don't know exactly whether all the items that I saw in January in the base, in that basement by Ashokdam temple, I don't know where they were found exactly, but I presume they were from the Rajana mound. Also, next slide, please. These Gata Pallava pillars are great because they're a type with the vase on top, vase on bottom, and then you have a square base usually, and then different sections carved in, polygonal, octagonal, and it goes up to circular at the top, and you have a smaller, sometimes, vase at the top. the way their designs change, particularly in this earlier period, are quite telling. So these are 5th century, 6th century pillars from UP. Sorry, that one's from Bihar, so that's from Madhya Pradesh. These are from UP. And they're similar in conception to the pillar from Rajana. And at this point, when you have the half moon filled with decoration, and then at the bottom you have these kinkinikajalas, which are these festoons, and nothing hangs down from there. They cut across in a straight line. Next slide, please. Then by the 7th century, same these half moons, kinkinikajalas, makaras, you start getting these chains or floral hanging down from the mouth, okay? So, and then you start getting, particularly in this Magadha kind of region, this burst of flowers coming up from the vase on the bottom. Next slide, please. I hope we get a, maybe actually go back, go back 2, just so I can make an obvious point, but go back a slide, please, and back one more, and back one more. Oh, sorry, back one more. These are actually part of one big pillar. So these would have been the base of a tall pillar. And they don't have the dangly bits. They don't have the bits hanging down, which you would expect if they were 7th century. So this is just an opinion. This is where I'm coming from. Okay, next, move forward, please. The other reason I think that there are Gupta period remains, or at least early 6th period remains at Ashokdam. Next slide, please. And I'd be interested to hear about inscriptions and other evidence for it. This is in Patna Museum, supposedly from Rajana. It's very similar to a piece I found at Mandeshri. The same bend of the hip, the same swoop of the sash against the base. This is from the Met Museum. It's described as male figure, Bihar, 6th century. This similar short fringe of curls coming down, similar bun. I'm not an art historian, but I would say there's enough evidence to suggest that there was early 6th century, at least, history at Rajana. Okay, next slide, please. But the majority of the fragments of the temples, I think, come from later. And if we're going to do a preliminary analysis, next slide, please. One of the easiest things to do is count the Amalaka, because these come from Latinas, like this one, that are topped by a little Amalaka. So immediately, very simply, you can count them, and there are 12. So obviously that's the bare minimum, but there were at least 12 temples there, small temples, probably more, I'd say. Okay, next slide. And then we have this rather hodgepodge of stuck together elements. And if we're looking at this, what we're seeing is, next slide please, a mixture of door jambs and corner pillars. These are the door jambs here, the slender ones, and they have little, usually female figures in a little shrine, then a kirtimukha with a sort of chain hanging down with a flower on the end. And then what's really key here is this geometric sort of scrolling. Some of it is a semicircle, some of it has got 90-degree corners. Next slide, please. And there's another part. This is also from Lakhisarai. Next part, next slide. So here's a close-up. Do you see this? You have little lotuses in the round ones. It's going around. This was interesting to me because the vast majority of temples with this design come from the 5th to the early 6th century. You don't tend to, and I say tend to, you don't tend to get it later at all in this mainstream Nagara temples. And I've already judged that they're mainstream Nagara just from the overview. Next slide, please. So, for example, at Shakor in Madhya Pradesh, you get this same thing with the circles and the square, this geometric scrolling. You don't, certainly in the more central territories, you don't get this in the 7th century and onwards. Next slide, please. Similarly, Bumara, beginning of the 6th century, this same detail on the door lintels and door jambs. This is from Sarnat, beginning of the 6th century. So immediately the clues are that it's early, right? Except, next slide please, there is one, and this is the only example I know of a later example of this design, and that comes from Bodh Gaya, 7th century Bodh Gaya, with this same motif. So that's an interesting clue. The other reason I think it's not 6th century, even though the other temples that have this are 6th century, is that, next slide please, is that they work with the pillars. The proportion of the doorways work with the pillars. You know, the different elements are in sort of similar parts, and I feel pretty sure that the pillars aren't 6th century. So automatically this suggests that the doorways are linked to the ones at Bodh Gaya. Okay, next slide please. So looking, we've got so many of these little pillars, very beautiful. Next slide please. It's a close-up. Gorgeous beading, the vase of plenty at the bottom with the flower coming up, and the tongue of the sort of combination of imagery with the tongue of the Kirti Mukha that also becomes beaded, the flower at the end. But the beauty of the carving is apparent. Next slide, please. These are very similar, and again, we're referencing Bodh Gaya, which would make sense in terms of sort of transmission of mainstream Nagra. These are very similar to the pillars, 7th century pillars you see at Bodh Gaya. So automatically, these are from Mandeshri, similar Gatapalava pillar types. So looking at it together with the door frames, which could be 6th century, and the pillars, I think this is probably likely to be 7th century, because later it's different as well. Later, you tend to get a central band of foliage down the middle of Gatapalava pillars. So I already feel strongly located in the 7th century, possibly early 8th. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then if we look at other elements, and that is part of the Latina shikaras. And what's interesting here is Gavaksha. Gavaksha relate back to both the shape of dormer windows that you see in early depictions of ancient timber architecture, but they also relate to the horseshoe arch gable of Vallabhi temples as that get translated into the cave temples, for example. So what's great about them is in the mainstream Nagra tradition, in the 7th century and not before, they start to follow a specific set of proportions. So at this point, the horseshoe arch, what would have been an inside edge that goes straight down have joined up to form a circle. And the different elements of the Gavaksha, the top knot, I call them the hands and the feet, but they accord, and as they accord to a standardized set of proportions which holds for mainstream Nagra temples from the 7th century onwards all across northern India. And it's one of those key signature moves, which means if you see it, if it's that type of proportion, you can immediately put it in mainstream Nagra, because the other traditions do it differently. The proportions are out. So this is from Nalanda, from Temple 2, and it's like a thumbprint. It's a signature indicator that we're talking mainstream Nagra, and because of other details as well as the sense of proportion that we're in the 7th century. And then next slide, please. So this is the type, although we have the Karnakuta, which is the little Famsana shrines that go on the corner, which we'll talk about. We have the Lata with the Gavakshas climbing down a ladder of eaves. We have the Amalaka on top, and we're getting a fairly, if you see the way the design is with the central Gavaksha, 2 halves on either side, central Gavaksha, 2 halves on either side, we're getting a fairly standard mainstream Nagra arrangement. Next slide, please. What's really interesting, quite telling, is that if you look at the pillars, you see that they're carved on adjacent sides and the rest is plain. What that means, or that indicates to me, is that they're meant to go on the corners of the shrine. And if you have corners on, if you have pillars, on each of the corners, then we know we're talking about mandapika shrines, which is a very particular type. Next slide, please. So mandapikas, and we call them such because this is a mandapika example, which I'll talk about. It has an inscription on it that says mandapika, and they relate to timber pavilions where you'd have had you'd have had pillars on the corners, and then you would have had planks or sometimes lattices going in between. And they're sort of a simpler version of temples. The walls are thinner. They're often done like flat packs, where you get the whole of the wall coming up, as opposed to ashlar rows. So, for example, here's one in Madhya Pradesh. Again, they're in this mainstream Nagra tradition. One in Madhya Pradesh from the beginning of the 7th century, from Mahwa, Madhya Pradesh. It's a goddess temple, late 7th century. Next slide, please. They go, this is how the mainstream travels. This is probably closer to what we'd be looking at, not in size, but just the fact that instead of having multiple pillars, you have just them on the corners. Next slide, please. But in a way, Batesara in Madhya Pradesh is a very useful thing to think about when we're thinking about Ashok Dam, because Batesara is this cluster of little temples, a cluster of latinas, and within that cluster, although it's a bit later, you get a few of these mandapika shrines. So when we're thinking about our Ashok Dam examples, they're smaller, they're earlier, and the pillars are much more beautiful than these ones. But it's not dissimilar. It's an earlier, smaller version. Next slide, please. And what's quite interesting, I think, is that in the Batesara examples, whereas you have more elaborate Dvarapala, door guardians with attendants and ornate doorways on standard temples with thick walls, ashlar courses, on the mandapika shrines at Batesara, you have little female figures in little niches, which is what we're seeing at Ashok Dam. So here, these are ones from Ashok Dam. Okay, next slide, please. This is Nareswara in Madhya Pradesh. Similarly, big temples have elaborate door frames, Dvarapala. This little small one, Mandapika, has a little sort of niche for a solo figure. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, this is just to show you. When I went in 2006 and it hadn't been put back together, I took this from Google or something, and it's been rebuilt up, but you just get this cluster of temples. Right, next slide, please. And we have all the bits. We have all the bits for the temples. There are door lintels, and I mean, when we talk about date, I do think they were built, maybe ones were built at different times before anyone says that a door lintel is a different time. But we have these kinki nikajalas, that is garlands, that would go across the top of the door. You'd also see them perhaps on the side of the walls above the niches. We have the avatars of Vishnu. We have saptamatrikas, which could perhaps go above the door lintel. Here's another lovely kinki nikajala with kirti mukhas. Next slide, please. And then we have the shukanasa. Shukanasa are like the antechamber before that. So you have the mukhamandapa, perhaps, porch. Then you have this antechamber in front of the sanctum that's conceived of as a Vallabhi temple. If this is, I mean, don't worry if this is just, but it's like a Vallabhi temple pushing out the front, which means that you have these horseshoe arched. This is like a barrel roof temple pushing out of the front of the other temple. So you'd have big chandrashala, big gavaksha on the front with half gavakshas at the side. So this is what these are. This probably would have capped one of these, and it would have been on the front of the antarala. It would have been part of the Shukanasa that would have been on the front of some of these little temple shrines. Next slide, please. So we have these, we have lots of bits, and then we have niches that don't look too dissimilar to the ones at Bethesda, to be honest, in terms of basic format. Okay, next slide, please. These were quite a headache. I found them quite confusing because A, they've been doctored a lot. Someone's come back in later and added designs. I think maybe because people are used to steles, used to the look of Pala period steles, maybe they're kind of being created in a sort of stele kind of fashion, as if they're a separate architectural, sort of sculptural piece, when in fact they need to be part of the wall in order to fit in order to attach to the temples. I got very confused. Some of them I thought might be modern versions. Some of them are convincingly to me, this one for example, some of them are convincingly 7th century to me. And I can tell that from the detailing on the gavaksha. For example, let's see if we can see. Next slide, please. This is 7th century. This is late 7th, early 8th century. And things like, this is 7th century. If you see the little wings that go on top, you see this little, it's almost like a berry. That disappears in later ones. So if you go to the next slide, please. So do you see here the way this has got this little detailing? But they're doing it right, inverted commas. You know, they're looking at the Western examples, 7th century examples, and they're getting the proportions right, they're doing the details right. The features that would indicate to me, if I was looking at a Western gavaksha, that it was 7th century, not 8th century, are appearing on the gavakshas here. The little round, this is from Mundeshri, little round flowers, this sort of contouring in the center, beautiful makara face, swirling. Surya looks good to me, it all looks good. Some others though, next slide, although perhaps the sculptures are okay, the gavakshas start going a bit wonky in terms of the way the hands are done, the way the feet are done. This one, obviously it's confusing because the pillars have been doctored. The pillars here have been doctored. So what we're looking at, here we have to think, are we looking at, what we're imagining is craftsmen, guilds of sculptors and architects, local ones, working in this harder stone, which is probably harder to carve than sandstone, not used to the sort of the traditions that have bred the Western mainstream architecture, taking on board this new tradition and trying to reproduce the wall shrines. So one could argue, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it less right. That could be why we're looking at rather strange, slightly strange looking 7th century wall shrines, because the pillars look good. But one could argue that in East India, stone pillars are always carved because you have beautiful stone pillars in front of brick temples. This isn't anything new. Whereas perhaps these are new, which is why you're seeing a sort of strange shape to some of the superstructures of the wall shrines. Next slide, please. There are also iconographic links to what's happening in 6th, 7th century, further west in Bihar. This is from a village near Mundeshri that there's a paper I'm writing on it. It's very fascinating. It's coming out next year. And you see these Vallabhi shrines. We see shared iconographic features. For example, here's a Lakulisha in a gavaksha with half gavakshas at the side that's distinctly linga looking, which emphasizes the sort of linga-based focus of Pashupata Shaivism with the Lakulisha in the middle. Here, this will be from one of the spires of the little Mandapikas, we get another Lakulisha, patron saint of Pashupata Shaivism, in a linga-shaped center. Next slide, please. So it's quite tricky. What's tricky about it is, I suppose I've slightly said this before, but when are we seeing 7th century architects carving 7th century mainstream and doing it well? And are we then seeing later architects copying the earlier East Indian versions of the mainstream temples? I think these shrines must have been added to. I think it must have. It was interesting that you were saying that you thought that the inscriptions suggest that it goes on for many centuries. So maybe these little Mandapika temples were continually added to. What was their purpose? Often groups of little temples, they could be votive, sometimes they're commemorative, but with inscriptional evidence, it could well be that they were just added to as and when someone had the reasons and the funds, and this proceeded, and therefore you get little changes of style just because of chronology. And they're sort of copying what went before. And an example of that is that you get some Pala period equivalents of a distinctly non-Pala architectural idiom. So I would suggest this is a sort of hub, like an exciting architectural hub that's well known for having these Western-style little temples and a collection that are being added to. And as far as we have remains, it's the only example we have a collection of East Nagara, these sort of cousin of the mainstream Nagara being built. And perhaps this is why there's slight changes in them. So this, I would say, looks like a Kanakuta stack for a Latina temple, but the center of the Gavaksha has become a bit detached from the base, which is, I could go on and on about this, but this is getting towards a Pala Gavaksha, a Pala period Gavaksha. So it's a Pala period mainstream Nagara miniature temple, which is, I think, a slight foible, a slight sort of bit of whimsy, because at the same time you'd have a different architectural school continuing and growing the brick temple, black stone detailing, for which the Pala dynasty, not the Pala dynasty, but the medieval northeastern area is known for. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a typical Pala period Gavaksha. The proportions have changed. It's become this sort of squashy, flat Gavaksha. The centre has started floating up a little bit. How am I doing for time?
Sorry.
It's okay? Next slide, please. So there's lots to talk about, but one of the reasons Krimila is so exciting and Ashokdam is so exciting and that clump of temples is so unique and exciting is it's our only example. We've got the development of mainstream temple architecture, the biggest, strongest, most successful North Indian temple building tradition there is, that has pure mainstream Nagara temples being built at Nalanda and Bodh Gaya, so in Magadha heartlands. We get this sort of offshoot, this cousin family, these cousins of the mainstream, this lineage, and this is the only example we have of this cluster of Latina temples being built in this uniquely Eastern Nagara style, not Pala period style, not Magadha style, mainstream Nagara, but with an Eastern flavour. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to say, when I have been working on remains in Bihar, the sandstone sort of pure mainstream Nagara, at one site I came across, there are some early 6th century remains, possibly Vaishnavite, from when I think the late Guptas and the imperial Guptas were just giving up their last vestiges of control over that sort of Madhya Desha, southwest Bihari region. And then there are also some late 6th century, early 7th century remains, Pashupata Shaivite, a whole different style of mainstream Nagara. And I think they fall on either side of this pivotal period in temple architecture where you get the end of the late Gupta, the beginning of the mainstream Nagara temple architecture. We haven't had examples of this before, but I happen to have found some, so that's quite exciting. And I then link the rise of the Maukri dynasty with propelling, helping, along with the Skanda Purana, Pashupata Shaivism surging out from various places, including Varanasi. I think it all combines to propel the genesis and development of this architectural tradition, which is about to sweep off around the world. I wonder if what you're getting in Krimila is a slightly delayed, which would be understandable, surge of the period when the Maukris took over the region, and then the Vadanas, and then it's possible that with them they brought this central Indian, sorry, not central Indian, this mainstream Nagra tradition with them, and then they fall, and whatever happens, it gets sort of turbulence, unrest. But we've already got this little pocket of cool temples that are being built, and it continues on as part of this celebration of these little temples. But I wonder if it's linked with the Vadanas and the Maukris. Next slide, please. So that was going to be, if I had too much time on my hands, there were things that we could talk about, but I feel like we may have reached the end. Oh, one thing I was thinking was that maybe when Claudine was talking about the particularly Lakhisarai style of Pala period steles and sculptures, and when I was looking at them, and I'm coming at it as a novice, I'm more familiar with perhaps non-Lakhisarai Pala period steles. To me, what I was struck by was how, in a way, they have a flavour of Gupta about them still, because unlike other steles, the flesh of the belly, there's a softness to them, a softness of the cheek. When you have the lotuses that are curving round, you can see the details of the seed pods with the circles. That's in a different way, that's what you'd see in the 6th century, and so around the 6th century and immediately post-Gupta. So I wonder if the fact that we're seeing mainstream Nagra, post-Gupta temples and Gupta period temples in the dark stone, maybe this celebration, creativity, Eastern version of that we see in temple architecture continues through and helps flavour what this particular Lakhisarai medieval style is. That was just a thought when I was looking at Claudine. And I've said Itkuri, because a couple of years ago I went to Itkuri, and the other place that's got a similar interesting thing happening is the remains of the Itkuri temple, which is sort of mainstream Nagra, but sort of not. So that was the end.